Welcome to the National Newspaper Publishers Association's Let It Be Known. 13 Republican state attorneys general have sent a cautionary letter to the CEOs of the 100 largest U.S. companies, highlighting the potential legal ramifications of using race as a factor in employment practices. The letter follows the recent Supreme Court ruling striking down affirmative action in higher education. It has stoked fears that the court's ruling will extend to corporate America. Today, we speak with Judith Browne Dianis, the executive director of the Advancement Project. How you doing, Judith?
I'm good. How are you?
Well, hey, another day.
Another day.
Judith, I know that the Advancement Project does some amazing work. And when you get decisions like this from the Supreme Court on affirmative action, first of all, what is the initial reaction and how difficult does it make your job?
hmm Well, my initial reaction to the Supreme Court decision was no shock, no
Yeah.
surprise. We have a conservative majority, and they have been whittling away at affirmative action for a long time. I think it's really important that we understand that this was a strategic hit job on affirmative action. There are cases that the right and the conservatives keep bringing over and over again to get the right plaintiffs and the right judges to strike it down. And so this has been over and over again. You know, if you think about it, years ago there was the case that was the Michigan University of Michigan. It's what I tell my daughter, who she was 9 months old when we stood in front of that Supreme Court for the protests around that case. And that was 2003. She's getting ready to go to Michigan in the fall, transferring there. So we have to understand that this is not a one-off,
Right.
right? And what they've done is that they've also changed the strategy to get to use Asian Americans as their test case now. And so it's not surprising. It's been happening for a long time. There was the Bakke decision back in the 70s, 80s rather. And so this has been a long trajectory.
Yeah.
Justice O'Connor said 25 years. And they said, we ain't waiting for 25 years. We have, they're like, we have the majority now. And
Right.
so they decided that this would be the opportunity. So no
Well,
surprise. I think it makes everybody's job harder because it means that schools are going to be rolling back their diversity.
mhm,
It means that for like an organization like Advancement Project in particular, that we'll probably see fewer Black lawyers, right,
mhm.
coming out of law schools. So we're really kind of where schools are going to become, or predominantly white schools, right, are going to become more exclusive. And
Yeah,
that's happening at the same time that they're erasing our history by getting rid of with the book bans
there you
and
go.
getting rid of all the diversity initiatives.
So, as I mentioned at the top, these 13 Republican attorneys general wrote a letter to Fortune 100 CEOs, and
Mhm.
it's really interesting, and it's the direct response to the affirmative action decision of the Supreme Court. And I'm going to dissect it just a little bit, not the entire letter. It's
Yeah.
just like a 10-page hazard to your brain. But
Mhm.
here's a little bit. Here's what they say, quote, racial discrimination in employment and contracting is all too common among Fortune 100 companies and other large businesses. And an inversion of the odious discriminatory practices of the distant past, today's major companies adopt explicitly race-based initiatives, which are similarly illegal. So that essentially, what they're trying to persuade these Fortune 100 companies is
Mhm.
to get rid of any type of um,
Right.
scenario where they would hire a person of color or a minority
Mhm.
individual to certain positions,
Right.
and
Right.
so
And
it, it
the
they
court
kind of
didn't say
extended it
that.
out.
The court didn't say that. Court's
Right.
talking about higher ed, right? And so
Hmm.
what this is is that this is an excuse to go back to all white everything, right? And for those companies that were not committed to diversity, this is their opportunity to say, okay, we're getting rid of those programs, right? But it's not just diversity. Here's the other thing: is that in the Supreme Court, the affirmative action cases in higher ed, there was a moment in which the courts moved from the fact that affirmative action was really a remedy for discrimination to instead saying it's about diversity and the need for diversity in
Hmm.
higher education, right? These companies, right? Yeah, they need diversity, but they also still need the remedy for hiring discrimination, right? Like we know all the cases that have been brought around, what or the studies that show that, like, if your name is a particular name that indicates that you are Black, you are less likely to get an interview, right? There's enough
Exactly.
information out there that the workplace continues to be a place where, if your hair is a certain way, right? That's why we have the Crown Act passed in places. And so um, people need to understand that this was not about employment. If they want to make
Mhm.
it about employment, they got to bring the cases to show
Well,
that
and
it's
that's and
about
that's ex yeah, exactly, and they seem to be pushing that. We saw too, and the attorneys general who wrote this letter, also sort of, not sort of, but they did note that they suggested strongly that DE and I programs, that employers may have might constitute a form of discrimination. And we saw too that DE and I positions are already looking like they're targeted. Shortly after the Supreme Court decision, it was revealed that three prominent studios and the Academy of Motion Picture Arts and Sciences had gotten rid of their top diversity executives, including a position that they created just last year
Mhm.
to create more diversity, equity, and inclusion. We have to be careful because you're absolutely right, obviously, that this decision was about college admissions. However, we see where many are trying to push this.
Mhm. Yeah, I mean, again, like, this is like them doing what they always wanted to do, right? It's like, go back to all white schools, all white employment, all white, so again, this is an excuse. And if there's a
Hmm.
corporation that has decided that actually they never really wanted diversity, they did it probably, after 2020 because George Floyd was murdered and there's a so-called racial reckoning, and they're already getting rid of it because they didn't have the commitment in the first place, right? It was
True.
just a placeholder, right? So yeah, I think we're going to see a lot of that. But we're also going to see, companies that are saying, no, we're all in because we understand the importance of diversity in our workplace. We understand the importance of diversity in the marketplace, right? Like, if
Hmm.
you're selling stuff to people, like, we need all people at the table to give us the best ideas.
Yeah. I was reading something too, Judith, about the Brazil's affirmative action in Brazil and its federal universities. And it says that their policy requires every federal university to reserve at least half of all seats for students from certain groups. Out of that half, about half of the seats go solely to Black and Indigenous Brazilians. The other half go to low income public school students. Other universities are also free to set their admissions policies. But of course, in Brazil, they are concerned too, just like
Mhm.
we here in America, about what the high court is going might do there.
Right, right. Well, I mean, it's, that in particular is like way gone out of our system, right? Because that would be considered a quota system,
A
right?
quota, right?
God forbid you have quotas, right? There's quotas and then there's goals, right? And employment in particular, they use a goal system. And so, yeah, I mean, this is the other thing to understand is that fascism and white supremacy don't just exist here, right? That there is a spread across the globe of fascism. And so it's not, we will see it in Brazil, we see it in other places, right? And
Yeah.
so I think that also just means that we as voters, we as participants in this so-called democracy, we as activists, et cetera, have to keep raising our voices against these things and make this the norm, right? Like, yes, we do need diverse workplaces, right? It's just it's important to doing business. Schools need diverse student bodies. I think about, like, I went to the University of Pennsylvania undergrad, and I went to Columbia Law School. I'm sure that affirmative action was used to get me in, and that's not because I was not qualified, because
Right.
because affirmative action is not about lowering the standards, right? It is about using a system of saying, you know what, we don't have enough people that look like this in our school, or who come from this background, et cetera. And so, affirmative action helped get me in. It sure as heck did not help me get out and graduate and get that diploma. But that is, and like, I brought something that was important, I think important to that school. I laugh about, like, Columbia Law School, and how every time I would raise my hand, I could see a lot of the white kids rolling their eyes, like, oh God, here she goes. She's going to talk about race again. And I was talking about race in law school because my professors, for the most part, were not talking about race. And we're reading cases that are, like, steeped in racism and white supremacy. And we ain't talking about the underlying context for the cases. So, that what I could bring to that conversation that my white counterparts could not was, I think, important. And those people, going to be judges and attorney generals and all that kind of stuff. So I hope they learned a little something along the way.
Well, you mentioned lowering the standards, which affirmative action does not do, as you aptly put. But an argument can be made that what does lower the standards is these who get in because
Yeah.
of endowments, their uncles
The
or
legacy.
fathers'
Yes.
legacy.
Yes.
Could you talk about that a little bit?
Sure. I mean, this is the way we uphold white supremacy, right? Is by giving white privilege, right? Like, let's not, also, there's other things people start calling that, well, that's a white people's affirmative action. No, that's white privilege. It's not affirmative action. It is white privilege, right? And that's the way in which we maintain a system of white people on top, right? Because, like, if your granddaddy's name is on the side of a building,
Yeah.
I know at Penn we had a lot of those, and I can tell you they weren't very smart. Those the grandchildren were not very smart. So, this and
See?
that is not what that's not what they look at. It is, like,
Hmm.
literally, I remember even on college applications that my daughter's filling out, they ask, like, did you have somebody, in your family that went here? Well, why is that important? Really?
Right.
Why? Like, why? And I know that these schools look to see, and how much did that person give in terms of money, right? Because it's
Hmm.
about, these are, institutions that rely on the money of alumni. And so, if you, even for me, if I gave money to Penn, I'm giving my little $100, right? Meanwhile, the white folks are, like, putting their names on buildings because they, like, paid for a whole building to be built, right? So my legacy ain't going very far. Uh, so, so it relies also on that system also relies on the racial wealth gap that is due to discrimination in employment, right? And it just allows, the continuous accumulation of wealth and privilege to white people.
So how do we remedy this within the community? Obviously, um, the federal government now is very limited. The government itself is limited in what it can do. The Supreme Court is the
Mhm.
law. It made the decision, right? What
Yeah.
what can we do as a community?
Well, I think number one, I think we're going to see a lot of an increased enrollment in HBCUs.
Can they handle
That's
it
for
though?
sure. I mean, that's a question, right? That means that there should be probably more money going towards them. And and I wouldn't be surprised if we start to see a tax on HBCUs in a real, like, strategic way, right?
Right.
Saying that that's actually discrimination, while we know that they're historically Black colleges that were set up as a remedy for discrimination because we couldn't attend white schools, right? And so I think, I also think that pressing on, if you're an alumni of a predominantly white institution, We need to be, fighting to make sure that they do what they need to do to continue Black enrollment at those schools. And
But
so that
Judith,
means use our alumni, just
uh-huh.
the way that the other alumni are being used.
Yeah, I'm sorry.
Yeah.
But going back quickly to HBCUs, will we now see a heavy white applicant base for HBCUs?
Well, I mean, I think, HBCUs are already seeing some white students, right? And, yeah, I think so. But like, not everybody's going, like white folks don't like to be in the minority now. So we're, we're, so I don't know that we're going to see a whole like influx, you know what I'm saying?
But
Like,
where does that put? Okay, so where does that put an HBCU decision maker, whoever makes the decision enrollment? Where does that put them? They turn down a white applicant. Isn't that doesn't that get to be more dangerous now? Or less dangerous because of affirmative action?
well, I mean, I think, I'm not in the admissions business. So
Hmm.
that's my first disclosure, right? I also think that HBCUs are looking for particular kinds of students. That's not, I mean, it's not just race, right? But like, do you understand our history? Are you committed to like Black empowerment? Are you like, there are a lot of other factors that I would bet they consider in admissions.
Yeah, yeah. It's going to be interesting. I've heard so many discussions about HBCUs, and we briefly just touched on it here as far as whether or not they'll be able to, um, contain or even be able to, um, accept the type
Yeah.
of enrollment that might now come their way because,
Yeah.
you know, this ruling by the court.
Right. And and most of them have been under resourced for a very long time, right? And so yeah, it may be a struggle, but you might see more people stepping up to invest in HBCUs also, right?
Yeah.
Alumni who actually do have money, or other people who didn't go to HBCUs that know the importance of the role that it plays. And I think this is the other thing about HBCUs is that while we're seeing this, kind of like the decrease in the number of students at predominantly white institutions, we're also probably going to see an uptick in racial incidents on those
Mhm.
racist incidents on those campuses, right? And that students of color may not feel as comfortable going to those schools any longer because it may become a hostile environment for them. So you may see more, Black students in particular going to HBCUs to be in an environment where they don't have to deal with that, right? Which is like we saw the uptick after 2020, right? Like
Mhm.
young people were like, I don't want to deal with that, right? Like this is, I want to be someplace where I can learn and just not have to deal with racism on campus or racism by the police, etc. So I think there'll be good reason for young people to seek out those opportunities.
Yes, the way you describe it too, I mean, it's so on point, but it also sounds like we're going full doing that circle again, Jim Crow,
Yeah,
Reconstruction, and all of
yeah,
that.
yeah.
Um, uh,
And that's because I mean white supremacy um readapts, right? And it's like basically like they're like y'all have gotten too far. Wait, hey, you've gone a little, like you're gaining too much,
yeah,
right? And the demographics of our country are shifting, right? The browning of America means that the people who
and
practice
isn't that the
and
biggest fear?
yes, that is
Is what 2045, I guess,
right.
is the
Right.
estimate
And it's
that.
and I want to say this is
Uh-huh.
fear, not as in fear that I'm scared, right? Like I'm scared, like, oh my God, but like fear as in like the loss of power, right?
Right.
The loss of privilege. Like I don't want to lose my privilege, right? And be like, outpaced by these others, right? And so I think that's what's driving voter suppression. That's what I mean, that's what's driving like the whole criminal narrative, right? It's like trying to put us back in our place.
Mhm. And it also seems to indicate we talk about this a lot. We have guests, we have other journalists come on this program and talk about this a whole lot, Judith, and that is the long-term, unwavering strategy of Republicans as opposed to Democrats who seem to plod through while Republicans are, in other words, it seems that Democrats play checkers and Republicans continue to play chess.
Yeah. Well, I mean, we're on the defensive a lot. And they have a lot of money to move their ideas. They want to take us backwards, right? Like you think about Roe
Mhm.
v. Wade, like they were plotting that for a long time. And
Since they
so
instituted it.
yeah, right. And they just kept going after it. They kept bringing cases, they kept passing legislation. They do take these like ideas of like, okay, what is the right that we want to undermine? And then they're just going to go after it and stick with it for a long time. But that's also what you can do when you have privilege, right? When you don't
Yeah.
have privilege, you got to fight for the scraps. You got like we need health care. We need, like it's like that kind of thing that you're like, always fighting to to get the next thing to protect our people, right? And
Hmm.
that's the defensive posture is hard. And it's hard to like when you're on the bottom of a society, it's actually hard to have the long vision and like keep with it. I mean, it is what we need, but it's also that we have to have people that invest in that over the long term, and that's not what we have.
Yeah, it seems to really underscore some of the things that agitates the black voter, doesn't it?
Right, right,
Because
right.
they're leaned on a lot. They're leaned on
Yep.
heavily every
hmm
election.
Yep. 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 And yeah, we are. But we also understand the importance of it. I mean, I think I'm worried about voter fatigue and things like that in 2024. But I also think that, you know, we don't have time to be on fatigue. Like
Mhm.
there's no option in that, right?
Yeah.
Because so much is at stake. If we haven't learned how much is at stake over the past couple of years with the loss of affirmative action, the loss of the right to abortion, like that, like even the loss of like student loan, the debt repayment, like that was out there. Biden, did what he was supposed to do, and who attacked that?
Yeah.
Republicans, and they took that to the Supreme Court, and it should have never been in the Supreme Court. But the
Right.
Supreme Court, those justices were doing the job that they were sent there to do. They were protecting Republican ideas.
Yeah. And before we let you go, Judith, the advancement project. So, tell us a little bit more about whether in the vein of affirmative action or anything else you'd like to tell us that folks should know more about the advancement project.
Sure. So, we are a next generation racial justice organization. This issue around affirmative action is important to us because we do work in the area of educational justice, K through 12 education for students of color, that we know is important to this idea to have an opportunity for higher education. And we still have not solved the problem of separate and unequal in this country, right? And so that's the work that we are trying to do to make sure that every child has access to a high quality education. We also do work around, we have a campaign, a national campaign for police free schools. And that's because not only are our children not getting high quality education, but they're getting criminalized in school and arrested in school and assaulted by cops in school. So the same police officer we worry about in our neighborhood is in the school hallways. And so we have to be worried about that. We also do work. The other thing that's, of course, important here is our work around voter suppression and fighting voter suppression, because, again, this is right now we are at a battle for our democracy, right? And who are we going to be as a country when we grow up, right? Are we going to be an inclusive democracy that actually people of color who will be the majority have the power that matches our numbers? Or are we going to be still acting as the political minority? And
Mhm.
so we have lawsuits, for example, in Georgia and in Florida around the voter suppression laws there, and do work in other states with groups on the ground, people who are really in the fight on the front lines of these issues. So, and you can find us at www.advancementproject.org.
There you go, Judith Browne Dianis. We really appreciate you as
Thank
always,
you.
always dropping gems for us at the Black Press. We
Thank you.
appreciate you. Thanks so
Thank you
much.
so much.
All right. And we go to some headlines, folks. A history making heat wave that baked southern U.S. communities with triple digit temperatures over the weekend will offer little relief this week and could spread dangerous